Imagine you are a prisoner of war.
Don't shoot! I surrender!
You have surrendered. The fighting is over for you. In any normal war, with any normal army, that is the moment your suffering ends. So this should be the moment your suffering ends, right? Wrong. But not with the Japanese. If you were captured by Imperial Japan during World War II, the nightmare was just beginning. Prisoners were used as human targets for bayonet practice. They were forced to dig their own graves and then beheaded with a sword. Some were deliberately starved to death. The death rate for Allied prisoners in Japanese camps was as high as 37%. According to historian Yuki Tanaka, the Imperial Japanese forces captured around 350,000 prisoners of war during World War II. For comparison, the death rate in German prisoner of war camps was about 1.2%, and prisoners were not even the worst of it. In the territories Japan conquered, it killed civilians on a scale that still shocks the mind. In the Chinese city of Nanjing alone, somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 civilians were murdered over the course of just 6 weeks. Not in battle, but in the streets of their own city. This event would later be known as the Nanjing Massacre, a tragedy so vast that even today, the full scale is hard to comprehend. Babies were thrown into the air and caught on the tips of bayonets. 2 Japanese officers actually held a competition to see which one could be the first to behead 100 Chinese people with a sword. The story was reported in the Japanese press like a sporting event. There were also secret laboratories where live human beings, men, women, and even children, were subjected to experiments so horrifying that most people today still don't know they happened. So the question is simple, but the answer is not. How did an entire nation become capable of something like this? That is what this video is about. Not just what the Japanese did, but why they did it. And the answer takes us deep into Japanese history, into the classrooms where children were shaped into soldiers, into the psychology of men who had been beaten so often that they stopped feeling anything, and into the political crisis that handed a proud and ancient nation over to some of the most dangerous men who ever lived. Let's start at the beginning. To understand why Japan behaved the way it did in World War II, you first need to understand what Japan had been through in the decades leading up to it. Because Japan didn't arrive at that war as a stable, confident nation. It arrived as a country that had been humiliated, resentful, and increasingly controlled by men who had no interest in mercy. In the mid-1800s, Japan was almost completely cut off from the rest of the world. It was governed by a feudal system not entirely unlike medieval Europe. Power was held by regional warlords, and the country had been largely isolated from international trade and contact for over 2 centuries. The emperor existed but held little real power. Then in 1853, everything changed. An American naval fleet arrived in Tokyo Bay and made Japan an offer it could not refuse. Open your ports to trade, or we destroy your city. The Japanese knew they could not match American military technology. They agreed, and that humiliation burned into the national consciousness like a brand. Over the next few decades, Japan responded to that humiliation the only way it knew how. It modernized at an extraordinary pace. It adopted Western industry, Western technology, and a Western-style military. By the 1890s, Japan was already competing with the great powers of the age. It proved itself first by defeating China in 1894, then Russia, one of the most powerful nations on Earth, in 1905. Those victories were astonishing. They showed the world that Japan was not simply copying the West. It was beating the West at its own game. But here is where things took a dark turn. All of that success bred something dangerous. A belief that Japan was not merely equal to the great powers of the world, but superior to them. And when that belief collided with a series of diplomatic humiliations after World War I, Japan was denied a racial equality clause at the Paris Peace Conference, restricted in naval treaties, and told its people were not welcome to immigrate to the United States. The resentment that resulted was explosive. Japan had tried to play by the rules. It had modernized, militarized, and competed. And the West kept treating it like a lesser nation. That resentment did not disappear. It festered, and it was eventually channeled into one of the darkest political movements of the 20th century. Now, before we get to the politics, we need to talk about culture. Because part of the answer to why Japan behaved so horrifically lies in something that had been built into Japanese society for centuries. Japan had a warrior class called the samurai. They had governed Japanese society for hundreds of years. And at the heart of samurai culture was a moral code known as Bushido, which means the way of the warrior. At its core, Bushido emphasized loyalty, honor, and a willingness to die for one's cause. Surrender was not simply discouraged. It was considered the ultimate disgrace. It was better to die even to take your own life than to be captured by an enemy. A samurai who surrendered was no longer considered a person worthy of respect. In some cases, he was considered no longer a person at all. Now, the samurai as a class had actually been abolished after the Meiji Restoration in 1868. But the values did not disappear. They were reformatted and weaponized by Japan's military establishment for the modern age. In the years before World War II, Japan's school system was completely reorganized around military values. Children as young as 6 were drilled, marched, and taught that their highest purpose in life was to die in service of the emperor. One chilling phrase that was commonly taught in Japanese elementary schools was this: "The greatest honor is to come back dead." Let that sink in for a moment. That was what Japanese children were being taught. By the time a young man entered the military, this had been years in the making. And what awaited him in basic training was something that took those already extreme beliefs and pushed them further than most of us can imagine. Japanese military training was built around beatings. Officers would line up new recruits and slap them across the face, punch them, or strike them with wooden clubs, sometimes until blood ran down their faces. One phrase that officers repeated again and again was this: "I do not beat you because I hate you. I beat you because I care for you." This was not just cruelty for its own sake. It was a calculated system. A soldier who had been beaten, humiliated, and dehumanized by his own superiors would find it much easier to do the same to others. The cycle of violence was built in from the very first day of service. A man who had suffered enough violence stops registering it as something shocking. It simply becomes normal. And there is something even more important to understand about what Bushido had become by the 1930s. The original samurai code had genuinely emphasized mercy and chivalry alongside strength. But the version that was taught to Japanese soldiers in World War II was something different. A distorted, weaponized version. The idea that mercy was weakness. The idea that to spare an enemy was to dishonor yourself. The idea that those who surrendered had given up their humanity and therefore deserved no consideration at all. That is why Japanese soldiers treated Allied prisoners with such contempt. It wasn't random cruelty. It came from a belief system. Prisoners had surrendered. They had shamed themselves. They were no longer worthy of being treated as human beings. Here is something that will help explain a great deal about how ordinary Japanese men came to commit extraordinary atrocities. The Emperor of Japan was not merely a political leader. He was believed to be a god, not a symbol of divine authority, not a spiritual leader in a vague sense, a literal living god. According to Japan's traditional religion of Shinto, the emperor was a direct descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu. He was the earthly manifestation of the divine. To disobey the emperor was not just a political crime, it was a sin against heaven itself. This belief was not just a relic of ancient times. It was actively promoted and intensified in the years before World War II. The Japanese government enshrined it in an ideology known as Kokutai, which roughly translates to national polity. Kokutai held that the Japanese nation was a single sacred family, with the emperor as its divine head. Every citizen, every soldier, was an extension of that family, and their highest duty was obedience to its divine father. There was also a related concept called Hakoichu, which meant 8 corners of the world under one roof. This was the idea that Japan had a divine mission to bring all of Asia, and eventually the entire world, under its leadership. It was not simply nationalism. It had the quality of a religious crusade. The impact of this on ordinary soldiers was profound. When a general gave an order, that order was understood to carry the authority of the emperor. And the authority of the emperor was divine. An officer who ordered a soldier to execute prisoners was, in the soldier's mind, transmitting the will of a god. To refuse was inconceivable. Not just because of punishment, but because of genuine belief. This is also why Japanese soldiers were so rarely taken prisoner themselves. To surrender was to place your personal survival above the will of the emperor. It was the ultimate act of selfishness and dishonor. As a result, Japanese soldiers would fight to the last man, in situations that any other military in the world would have recognized as hopeless. At the Battle of Saipan in 1944, Japanese forces launched what became the largest banzai charge of the entire war. Over 4,000 soldiers, many of them already wounded, threw themselves at American lines rather than surrender. Hundreds of Japanese civilians on the island, who had been told by their government that American soldiers were monsters, jumped off cliffs to their deaths rather than be captured. The Americans watching were horrified, not by the enemy, by the tragedy of it. Now we come to what I think is the most important part of this whole story. Everything I have described so far, the Bushido Code, the emperor worship, the racial ideology, all of that was the foundation. But it does not fully explain why Japan crossed the line from an aggressive imperial power into something that committed atrocities on a scale comparable to the Nazis. For that, you need to understand what happened to Japanese political power in the 1920s and 1930s. Because what happened was essentially a slow-motion coup. The military didn't seize power in a single dramatic moment. It strangled civilian government over the course of a decade, assassination by assassination, until nothing was left. The process began with resentment. Japan's democratic politicians were associated with cooperation with the West, the same West that kept humiliating Japan. Nationalists and military officers saw those politicians as traitors. And they were not shy about expressing that view violently. In 1921, the Prime Minister of Japan was assassinated by a nationalist fanatic. In 1930, another prime minister was shot for agreeing to a naval treaty with Britain and America that the military considered too favorable to the West. In 1932, yet another prime minister was murdered when he tried to rein in the military's unauthorized war in Manchuria. That word, unauthorized, is key. Because what was happening in Manchuria in the early 1930s tells you everything about how completely out of control the Japanese military had become. A group of officers stationed in Manchuria, frustrated that the government in Tokyo wouldn't approve full military occupation of the region, simply decided to start a war on their own. They staged a fake explosion on a railway line, blamed it on Chinese forces, and used that as justification to launch a full invasion. The government in Tokyo was told about this after it had already started. It ordered the military to stop. The military refused. And here is the truly astonishing part. The government backed down. It endorsed the invasion after the fact. Because by that point, the military had made it clear that any civilian politician who tried to stop them could expect a bullet. This is the pattern that historians call geikokujo, a Japanese term meaning domination of a senior by a junior. Lower-ranking officers, the most aggressive and extremist men in the military, were effectively making foreign policy. And the generals, the cabinet ministers, even the emperor, either approved or looked the other way. By the mid-1930s, Japan was not a country with a government that controlled a military. It was a military that had absorbed whatever was left of a government. And the men who ran that military were not cautious administrators. They were ideological fanatics who genuinely believed in a divine mission and had no interest in the rules of civilized warfare. When Japan invaded China in full force in 1937, those men were in charge. And what followed was predictable, in retrospect. The Nanjing Massacre of 1937 is one of the most documented war crimes in history, and it is still not fully understood in the West. Over 6 weeks, Japanese forces murdered somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 Chinese civilians. The killing was systematic, organized, and in many cases carried out with a level of sadism that is difficult to put into words. One of the key reasons it was possible was something we have already discussed: dehumanization. From day one of their military training, Japanese soldiers had been taught that the Chinese were not just enemies. They were racial inferiors. Blood enemies, as the training manuals put it. Subhuman. The generals knew exactly what they were doing when they taught soldiers that. A man who has been convinced that he is not killing a human being can do things that would otherwise be impossible for him. The experimental laboratories are perhaps the most extreme example of this. Unit 731 was a covert biological and chemical warfare research unit of the Japanese Army. It operated in Manchuria from 1936 to 1945. Prisoners, mostly Chinese and Korean, were infected with diseases, subjected to surgery without anesthesia, frozen alive, exposed to pressure chambers until their eyes burst, and burned with flamethrowers, all in the name of research. Roughly 300,000 people died in these facilities. After the war, many of the officers responsible were never prosecuted. The United States government granted them immunity in exchange for the research data they had collected. The records were classified for decades. There is also the matter of what the beatings did to the soldiers themselves. Historians who have studied this period have noted something important. Japanese soldiers who had been brutalized throughout their own training had, in a psychological sense, been prepared for brutality. They had been victims of a system of violence for years before they ever held power over anyone. When they were finally given power over prisoners, over civilians, something broke loose. The violence they had absorbed flowed outward. That is not an excuse. It is an explanation. And there is a difference. Here is something that makes all of this even more striking. Japan had not always been this way. During the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905, just 3 decades before World War II, Western journalists actually praised the Japanese military for how well it treated Russian prisoners of war. One British correspondent wrote that the treatment could not be improved upon by any army in the world. During World War I, German prisoners in Japanese custody were apparently allowed to play football, take weekly excursions around the local area, and put on theatrical performances. That is the same nation, just 30 years earlier. So what changed? The short answer is everything. The humiliations piled up. The Democrats were shot. The generals took over. The schools became indoctrination centers. The emperor was turned into a god. The Bushido Code was stripped of its mercy and refashioned into something that glorified cruelty. And a generation of young men was produced who had been beaten into compliance, taught that the Chinese were subhuman, and sent to war under the command of ideological fanatics. It is an important reminder that the capacity for this kind of evil is not unique to any one people. What happened in Japan was the result of specific choices, specific conditions, and specific men with specific agendas. Change any of those factors, and history looks different. Japan today is one of the most peaceful nations on Earth. Its post-war constitution actually contains a clause renouncing war as an instrument of national policy. The transformation from the nation that committed the Nanjing massacre to the nation that produces Studio Ghibli films and sends foreign aid around the world is one of the most remarkable reversals in modern history. But understanding how it fell into that darkness is not just a history lesson. It is a warning. Societies do not collapse into atrocity all at once. They are pushed there, step by systems and ideologies and leaders who know exactly what they are doing. And the first step, always, is convincing people that the other side is not fully human. That is something worth remembering. If you found this video interesting, the story of Japan in World War II goes much deeper. In a future video, we will look at the individual men who ran Japan's military, where they came from, what they believed, and how they justified what they did, even at the very end. Make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss it.